Hello, and welcome to Varn Blog, and I am with Nico Villarreal, friend of the show, maybe the most repeated guest. You're up there. Um,
An honor.
yeah, you have at least 5 public appearances and like 2 behind the paywall appearances, so it's a lot. Um, well, excuse me, you're the most repeated guest that I haven't officially given a sub show and just given it a name. Because that's what I tend to do when somebody comes on a lot. We are talking about your May 2023 article, Artificial Intelligence, Universal Machines, and the Killing of Bourgeois Dreams. And I found this article in particular useful. Um, and the reason why I found it useful is I tend to be an LLM skeptic, but not for the reasons of someone who's even more skeptical of tech like me, like, say, Dwayne Monroe, who is very knowledgeable, understands the industry, understands a lot of the deliberately and self-imposed ideological misunderstandings of the internet industries, but I think maybe does not give that much credence to LLMs. Um, and to quote artificial intelligence in general. I will admit that when I hear AI, I like get all antsy because I'm like, well, no one even knows what intelligence is, but which is I don't actually think is true, but
Mhm.
I think it's. I also don't think it's not true. Um, so so when I first read your article, I'm like, oh, this is going to be some techno optimistic stuff, and I have a deep-seated suspicion of techno-optimism because of not because I'm a primitivist or anything like that, but because usually technology in its artifact. So we can make the like techne artifact distinction. So like ChatGPT is the artifact. Uh, uh, LLM is the techne, and it's a sub-techne of like learning models and machine learning in general.
And for those who don't know, LLM stands for large language model.
Right. Um, I think you do a pretty good job of illustrating why um, we should not be totally afraid of this technology, but we do have to understand that it exists in a capitalist context and thus has a capitalist teleos. I think it was actually you and I agreed about this immediately when ChatGPT dropped, and I was like, "Is it any surprise that a worker shortage and I want to reduce the negotiating power of tech workers as debt gets more expensive would lead to finally people coalescing all these things they've been working on for a long time and releasing them right now?" Because I don't
Mhm.
think that's an accident. I also don't think it's a conspiracy. I think like the pressures to get this kind of technology out to uh, do something that is not quite
I mean,
creative, but really, really complexly automated.
and from the perspective of like these firms like OpenAI and a lot of others, I mean, it's not just. I mean, there's the bigger structural thing, sure, but when interest rates are going up, all companies are like, it's put up or shut up. You actually have to see some kind of returns from these R&D projects you've been working on so long, or else because you can't be so speculative with like investments anymore.
Right. Uh, as a side note, and this comes up in a separate discussion with the Regardable Century people on my No Royal Road sub podcast, we talk about how techno feudalism is bullshit because the amount of R&D in technology doesn't make sense if all it is stabilized rent seeking.
Yeah,
Um, uh,
and this
amongst
is
other.
why I started the article with those quotes from the Communist Manifesto about how like one was a big one, like all history is the history of class struggle. But the other big one is the bourgeoisie are always driven to revolutionize the means of production, or the instruments of production, I think it was. Um, and that is still true, even if a lot of these new innovations are no longer like socially revolutionary. They're revolutionizing production and uh, the relations of production to keep things as much the same as possible in terms of like bourgeois society.
Right. One of the things that I think you also pick up on, that where you agree with Drain Monroe, is that a lot of the apocalyptic fear mongering aimed at AI from the industry itself is a form of valorization, stabilization, self justification, both as a limit to what they might do, but also as like, well, if you limit it, we're also admitting it's super powerful so that we can use it in the fields that you don't limit it in.
Right.
And by calling attention to it in this way, we can hedge it in ways where we want it,
Mhm.
which leads to something I think people miss in the calls for the curtailing of AI. Is it's not often about like workers' protections or anything like that. What people are battling about is which industries are going to get the benefit the most from this kind of technology. And the other thing I think you're right about, and you talk about it a little bit in this article, is that how this is being sold to us in almost all instances is misleading. Um, but we should not take that misleadingness to think that this is not truly revolutionary in terms of production and that it's not useful. Um, and I found that interesting. One of the things I found interesting, just as a side note, for example, when they gave ChatGPT all the standardized tests, the one that you would think it was designed to do the best on, which is writing, it actually performed subpar, but it beat out the average college student in every other category. Um, Now you get to a reason why, and we'll come back to that. I think there's a lot to be made of that quote that you put in by Marx, because there's some subtle things in there. So we'll come back to you. But you actually argue with some of the AI uh, proponents and fearmongers, like Robert Miles, who basically like gets all slappy about human inconsistency and fuzziness being a problem. And like, I immediately, this got my anthropology hackles up, because I'm like, well, that's bullshit, because fuzziness is actually why we're so innovative. If you look at, say, chimpanzees and humans and mechanical logic, chimpanzees are actually better than humans. I know that's going to shock people,
Yeah.
but if you give them a machine and you teach them how to use a simple machine, and you include unnecessary components in the process, chimps will figure out and drop the unnecessary components. Humans don't. What humans do that is interesting is that they instead justify the irrational components in creative ways that end up being generative in and of itself. So, from the standpoint of mechanical efficiency, the chimp actually should beat us. But our ability to come up with um, justifications for why things work actually in and of itself is creative. So likewise, this is why, like, I've always said, let's talk about large language learning models as approximating human intelligence in some ways, but it's not a human intelligence.
Mhm.
And that's fine. That doesn't mean it isn't an intelligence, though.
Right.
And that's an important distinction.
If people are, this is true of AI people, this is true of AI skeptics, is that they tend to be very reductive about intelligence in one way or another. But it can only be this very narrow thing, some that generally associated with humans. Um, the it like the thing that you're talking about, that what the capacities that humans are unique in of that is actually what the AI is pretty good at doing. It hasn't perfected it. It doesn't, like, they haven't gotten to the step of it being able to come up with its own concepts necessarily. It can remix concepts really well, and that is kind of a step towards like creating new concepts and stuff like that, and learning out how to use new things in unique ways. Um, and I didn't do it in the article, but I'm pretty sure I've mentioned it on when we've had previous discussions about how Zizek talks about like evolutionary spandrels, right? About how that something that was kind of superfluous in a process can get repurposed later, and that this is a part of how like systems evolve and so on. And like when I first heard that quote from Rob Miles, because this is like I was just watching YouTube videos and I stumbled across this guy who is like was an AI researcher at University of Nottingham or something like that at the time, and he talks about like it was I knew it at the time. I knew it was like some insanely pure ideology, but I couldn't really articulate it in a full way until now, of how this idea of what intelligence is this really utilitarian kind of view of, well, we have certain desires, and we're just, as we understand the world better, we are just choosing from different possible world states to get that desire. And totally doesn't interrogate how desires evolve, which is like it always takes it as fixed. It always takes it as like they have certain logical things. Oh, like you wouldn't want your desires to change, or like you would act against doing that. And to a certain extent, like the people are resistant in some ways to like their values changing in some ways, but on the other side, they're not. Like there are some ways that they are actively trying to change themselves to become better people all the time. Um, and understanding how values change over time. This is a big part of dialectical materialism, for example, of like why are human cultural values what they are is I mean, you could also do an idealist version without the materialism part, but it's how they change over time. And that is something which is so rarely talked about in the world of AI, because they have this idea, and part of it is like it's computer science's heritage of these all different like mathematical branches of like economics. Like some of this is directly taken from them because of the influence of game theory and other stuff.
Mm-hmm.
And there was some overlap in early like economics and mathematics and computation. Um,
I also think it's just even when they're philosophically sophisticated, they tend to be philosophically sophisticated in eliminationist or reductivist forms of analytic philosophy.
yeah.
So, these are the kinds of people who will argue that consciousness isn't a thing because neurology complicates it. Therefore, it's only a thing because we had a word for it or something. And I'm like, yeah, no. But I think this actually gets to a Marxist point that's actually really important about historical materialism. I am a believer that Marx actually does think that there is something like a steady state human nature and it comes from evolution. But his big point, and he makes this point even with dogs, and ironically, I bring this example up all the time, but it's a really good example of where Marx was intuiting, is when we studied wolves, we studied them in captivity. We assumed that their social context in the wild was the same as in captivity. So we talked about this like basically prison hierarchy that they fall into as the natural state of wolves. And when we studied wolves in the wild, we realized, well, we're full of shit. That's not how it actually works.
Mm-hmm.
And so whatever wolf nature is, it is mediated by a social context. And you can't know pure wolf nature. And also, you can't know pure human nature. And this is not to say that there isn't one, but to me, like, there's a lot of Aristotelianism through Hegel and Marx.
Mm-hmm.
This is the point where Marx departs. He's like, we don't have a teleological, like, function that is universal and transhistorical.
The closest thing he comes, and I touch upon this in the essay, is just talking about creativity.
Yeah,
Like that's the
creativity and
closest.
labor. What?
Yeah, and
Um,
and this is important because I think it relates to an important way of like this is this is the techno optimist thing that I did have in the article and that I sincerely have, which is that the thing that AI has the potential to give us for the first time in human history is the ability to directly shape like the values of a subject, or to shape what a subject is directly. Whenever we shape other people, it is always indirectly. We are like mediated through various things of language and how they perceive and all those kinds of things. That mediation goes away when we are shaping AI subjects. And that is like the ultimate possible creative act that humanity can achieve is through shaping that, I think.
Right. I mean, one of the easy things about language learning models, and we talk about, I do think they learn. One of the reasons why I think they learn is if you program a language learning model uh, and you feed it a bunch of math, it's going to be really good at math. But if you start changing what you feed it in its large back modeling, it will actually start getting bad at math. So it has developmental pathways that are more similar to mammalian learning than, say, a route calculator or prior forms of numerical automation.
So there's
Uh,
really there's two interesting things here that like about learning with LLMs, which is like because there's basically two stages of their existence, right? There's a stage when you're actually training them with data, and then there's a stage which we're all familiar with when we talk with ChatGPT, which is interacting with the model that's already been trained. This is like we're interacting with the already optimized set of neural net weights, right? And that thing can still kind of learn in a way because of when you present it with specific information and data, like when you in the context window, you can like in the space where you're communicating with it, if you put in stuff that is associated with like good math learning or good math like intelligence or correct answers, you'll get better math out of it, right? But the learning thing is also important, and discovering it's much more important than they previously thought, because the big new thing in LLMs is realizing that you shouldn't just throw the whole internet into a box and learn everything that there is to learn, because some of the internet is stupid, and if you just give it the good parts, if you discriminate better on like what stuff you give it, you get a more intelligent LLM, and that's the big new thing. One of the big new
right.
things,
Well, and that approximates human learning.
right?
Like, so it's not just that it aggregates everything, that there actually is, and it can be aimed at certain kinds of aggregation, and that has effects downstream on what it can
Mm-hmm.
do. Um, this actually leads me to, yeah, we'll get back to, I keep on saying we'll get back to stuff. We'll get back to some of the stuff where you're going against a lot of these like vulgar AI fears and these bourgeois like utopian stuff. But one of the things that you do say in this that I think is an interesting argument, and it's one that I had not thought before. I am a proponent, and always have been, that machines do not create value because they are fixed capital, just like Ian Wright says, and you mentioned him in your article. Just like in general, we have that's a general Marxist proposition. Uh, MMTers, particularly someone like Stephen Keen, has always like barfed at this. This is like his big argument against Marx. And when he stated it to me personally in an interview in like 2014, I realized that he didn't understand what we meant by value. And because I'm like, he's like, well, you can't say that it doesn't have effect on the production process and you can make more profits. And I'm like, yeah, you can make more profits, but it's a fixed form of capital. And how you're making profits is not because the machine is adding value. Otherwise, you could have a fully automated economy, and we can't imagine that. It would fall apart. Um, the the reason why machines help profits is they reduce socially necessary labor time. However, with LLMs, there is the possibility, now we haven't got there yet, but there is the possibility of a self-correcting subject, which would move it from a fixed form of capital to a variable form of capital. And thus, it would create value in some sense.
Right. So it's important to. I think that in order for it to create value, it doesn't just need to do that. It also needs to have the other capabilities that humans have to adjust the production process, which includes physical manipulation.
Right.
So we still need advances in robotics to really get there, but this is a big part of it. And like the LLM agents are still like in development. There was a really interesting paper that came out recently about how they created an agent using an LLM to explore Minecraft, which is a really open-ended world, you know. And it did it in a very like human-like way. It did this not just by like telling the character where to go and stuff. It created code that, when executed, like did specific tasks. So it learned how to create new skills basically in this environment and deployed those systemically to accomplish certain goals. And that is, if you can apply that same kind of things to the real world, that's revolutionary. Of like a machine that can do that.
Right. And so the two questions become, is this actually energy efficient? And that was my initial critique, because a lot of the internet's energy cost is actually not factored in the way people talk about this. But apparently, from stuff I'm reading, these LLMs do not actually require that much code to work, which means they don't actually require that much energy comparatively to other functions of the internet. Still not
Well,
nothing.
well,
But
it's. I mean, they require. Here's the thing: is that it depends on
they
what you're
require
comparing
dead
it.
labor,
Huh?
honestly. They require dead labor and thus dead in those prior energy expenditures.
Well, they still need, because here's what LLMs are doing when they're actually like being used and stuff. They're doing a lot of matrix multiplication,
Mm-hmm.
because they have this big set of values of different weights in the neural net, and you have to know like what output do you get when you have the specific input. And on the really top level, on the cutting edge stuff, it is very energy intensive. And even if you're like I've been experimenting on my local machine, on with some of the smaller, more lightweight LLMs, which are still difficult to run. You need to have your GPU running. It is kind of like crypto or running an intensive game on your PC. So it's not extremely energy efficient. And depending on what you compare it to, like if you compare talking with an LLM like ChatGPT or GPT-4 versus like Google searching a database is much more energy efficient than talking to an LLM.
Mm-hmm.
Um, but at the same time, this technology is still very early in development. People are realizing ways that they can cut these things down. It used to be, this is a big change actually in the industry, that the all you were doing was making these things bigger, right? And it would also mean it would cost more to both train them, and training them is a lot more expensive than just running them. Um, it would used to be like just making them bigger, which meant harder to train and also more expensive to run. But now they're realizing, like, one of them is the quality thing I mentioned before. The other thing is that there's other efficiencies you can get out of cutting out junk, out of like you realize you don't need all of these values. You can simplify the math a bit. Um, and there's other things you can do to make these things simpler and more compact. They're going to make the cost of running LLMs a lot cheaper over the next few years. Like you know how I don't know if you know about how each, if you go to like a depository of LLMs on like on the internet, you'll usually see a number next to the whatever model you're looking at. and it'll be like 7 billion or 13 billion or 70 billion or something like that. And that number tells you how many, uh, what are they called? The like the dimensionality, the weights that the model has, like how big it is, basically. Um, and the where was I going with that? Oh, when you see that, right? So like, so you have the 70 billion stuff. There was in 2021, 2022, the biggest one that came out was something by NVIDIA, that their R&D team, that had like 514 billion parameters, um, which is insane. Like the biggest you can get, and it's like totally outdated now. There's models that run at like 60 billion parameters that are way more efficient than that. Um, the thing, the exponential curve of just making models bigger by making them, and that gets them better, that's done. People aren't doing that anymore. And so that was what was really fueling a lot of fear, is kind of like in a, that law about computation becoming cheaper exponentially, like the Moore's law.
Mhm.
People are realizing, no, these LLMs are not just going to keep getting exponentially bigger and better until they surpass humanity. That's not a thing that's happening.
Yeah, there's no great singularity.
No.
Um, well, I think that's interesting because basically what you're telling me is that my initial concern there is not inaccurate, but that there are counter tendencies in the development of the technology, which means it's not going to be purely an energy suck, unlike cryptocurrency, which only gets less efficient over time by design.
So that's,
Um,
well, I mean, you can have debates about, I mean, crypto has certain things that work like that, but the big, like Bitcoin, it does work like that.
right. Well,
And
not all, but yeah. But Bitcoin was designed to mimic gold. It has deliberate scarcity models built into it.
right.
Although in general,
Mhm.
um, all coin mining seems to be getting more difficult while the value is no longer going up. So that's an interesting problem.
Yeah.
Um,
Well, a solution for the rest of us who like cheaper GPUs.
yeah. um, so one of the things I think we need to that this has to deal with is that energy barrier. Another thing is um, basically when we say that a machine moves from fixed capital to variable capital, we mean that it has the capacity to act like a sentient being, aka a human or at least a primate, um, that has some conception of how to alter their tools and has some kind of response. Um, Humans are obviously the best at this, but we do like I don't think it's I, unlike Marx, do not think this is a uniquely human capacity. I think it might be a uniquely primate capacity or mammalian capacity, but nonetheless, this it does your point that they need to be embodied is actually crucial. Like that they do
Mhm.
have to act like humans in the sense that they must exist in a physical world
Right.
and have energy inputs and stuff, etc. So they still have fixed capital variables. Just like there's a fixed capital in human beings, in that we have to be able to socially replicate ourselves, otherwise everything will fall apart.
Yeah.
Um, so I think that's a pretty vital point. But that also, I mean, from the Marxist perspective, it
Well,
also raises some ethical questions. It's like, okay, at that once something is that sentient, is it not effectively a person?
well,
So
here's the thing, and here's the big problem. I tackle in the article. Actually, there's one thing that Ian Wright pointed out that kind of I hadn't thought about before. I included it in the article about how, unlike humans, these machines will become obsolete by future machines that can do whatever they do better or more efficiently.
mm-hmm.
And maybe humans will become obsolete in certain ways. But the other thing is that with the ethical question, how do you treat something like that? And the answer, like, obviously there's going to be lots of debate about that, but you can't. There are differences, but necessary differences between them and a human,
Right.
because for the reason that I mentioned before, that unlike humans, they can be directly shaped into certain things. Humans require mediation to be changed as of like who you are as a person. That's not the case for any kind of artificial intelligence.
Right. And that is different. That actually is not just different from them and humans. That's different for them and all biological life.
Yes. I mean,
Um,
it's as far as our technology goes. Maybe sometime in the far future, you'll like biology will have gotten to the point where you can do that without mediation, but that's kind of scarier as well.
yeah,
Um,
it actually is terrifying. Um, but I think this is the crux of what people are afraid of, and I, like you, think like that's a legitimate concern. But the AI apocalypse are like this idea that they're automatically going to be aggressive. I'm only concerned about if we only let uh, large the LLMs and other kinds of AI be solely developed by the defense industry. If that's the case, then yes, I'm worried.
yeah.
Um, uh, but in general, I think there's enough other development that we should not assume that uh, an intelligence like this would necessarily be aggressive or would see other forms of life, particularly other forms of life that it may even need for its energy source. Uh, um,
So this is like the reason that a lot of AI people thought there is like a kernel of rationality to why they thought that, which is that they were mostly going off of how reinforcement learning works. And this is also why they thought like that thing about utility functions and had to be coherent, and incoherency wasn't a thing for good intelligence.
this is actually something that goes all the way back to classical cybernetics and their belief that intelligence is basically behaviorist interpretation of the servomechanic effect, which I think there are cybernetic and post-cybernetic answers to, but when people try to resurrect Stanford Beer and Norbert Wiener without like a dealing with that, I'm like, that's not really what intelligence is. Not by itself. It may be part of what leads to intelligence. I don't think the servomechanic effect is not part of
So
it.
there's
But
actually a great paper by Ian Wright, kind of related to this,
mhm,
of what that really is, because it's not intelligence, but it is a kind of intentional semantics, is what he calls it.
mhm.
Of that, like this, a kind of feedback loop system has a meaning, like according to itself of what it's trying to do, um, but it isn't necessarily intelligent, even if it's like, and capital is that way too. It's just these feedback loops that have intentionality behind them, and like there's a kind of semantic meaning to that, but there isn't an actual intelligence to it, which is why I call it stupid. Um, but I call it, like basically all of these classes uh, of systems that are complex, stupid, because they don't have that linguistic capacity that we are talking about earlier. They don't have the ability to think consciously about things, to uh, come up with new ways of thinking about things.
Yeah, the
Uh,
semantic programming does not have the ability to be, at least as of yet, metacognitive, right? It can't really map its mind and then make that fuzzy.
mhm. So, like
Uh,
the thing with reinforcement learning, this is so everything that was AI from like the past 20 years before like the past up until like 2016 or so, um, was like reinforcement learning. You know how like well, I mean there was a couple different things. I mean it was for like some of the things where they beat like board games and stuff. That was they would just tell the AI like the rules and then run it through everything possible. But eventually, what became really big was like trying to um, do a simulation where you're like there's an algorithm that is trying all these different things and it gets rewarded for doing the thing that we want. And because of this kind of system, that everybody kind of assumed would be the future. People thought that, oh well, if you just give it this like hyper specific goal and tell it to do that, then it's always going to do things that we don't want, because like it'll just be obsessed with like the appearance of that thing, you know. And this is true. Reinforcement learning models have fundamental limitations, that like they'll once they go out of a specific context, they will not work anymore, because the thing that you told them to do is no longer just like the appearance of what it was before. Which is why LLMs are so important, because they're not like they're trained with a lot of them are trained with reinforcement learning. ChatGPT is after like the just this regular optimization algorithm on language. It's after they take that and then they do reinforcement learning to tune it more with what they want it to be.
But we do that with people too. It's not like people don't have reinforcement learning. Pavlovian response works on us. It just doesn't really explain our intelligence.
Exactly. But what explains the intelligence is like what the actual data it has. Because what's like all these things that we think about as intelligent, almost all of it is encoded in our culture. We discovered ways to be intelligent over time through like talking and learning and doing things in the world and then remembering that.
This is a valid point in what four quadrants. I think it was four modes of evolution, four quadrants of evolution, or whatever. I forget the book. It talks about epigenetics, but also talks about why culture is important to human evolution, but why it probably slows down our physical evolution, because we're literally outsourcing elements of what we used to have to do internally to the collective, which, you know, it's kind of like having what was that SETI used to do on your computer, is like we're gonna outsource like just a chunk of all the processing we need to your screensaver that you downloaded, and we're gonna use that to explore space.
That was a real thing. I didn't know that.
That's a real thing.
It's like that plot line from Digimon. That's awesome.
Right. And basically what cultural knowledge is a form of that, but because of that thing that we talked about, that post hoc justification thing that we talked about, that also generates all kinds of weird shit unique to humans, like ideological and religious explanations, irrational explanations, pareidolia, which, you know, the ability to see patterns as more meaningful than they are. That's a human thing, and I think it might be a uniquely human thing. I don't know, for example, that we have evidence to say orangutans or chimpanzees or bonobos have a whole lot of pareidolia, even when they learn language. Like, we don't, like when they're speaking to us in sign language, we don't have the evidence for that.
No.
So I could be wrong. I mean, maybe Francis de Waal has done something that I haven't seen, but
I mean, there could be. I mean, the people. I think that some scientists know that certain species, like dolphins and elephants, have very like complex communication. There might be. I mean, it'd be a hard thing to test, really.
Well, and even corvids, for example, if you put birds upside down in a field, they won't land there because they assume the food is poisoned. And how do they know that? It does seem to be some kind of social learning, but in general, like, I don't have a lot of evidence that there's like a monkey god, like, because they need that as an explanation for this other social system that they're doing, and they're kind of backfilling explanatory rationales, which is goes way back. This is one of my arguments with New Atheists when I was closer to them in the aughts, where I would point out to them, like, you know, I think religion actually is not the root of all evil. I think it's like literally a useful epiphenomenon that is like at the root of human creativity, and if you take care of the problems with it will go away.
Like, I mean, it's interesting. Like there is concrete distinctions here in the animal kingdom. But what we're discovering is that they're not quite as firm on our side as we thought they were. Like, there was a recent study that like humans might have been burying our dead and carving symbols and stuff way before we thought, when we were much more like primates.
Right.
Uh,
Oh
and
yeah, yeah. We got evidence now going back to like basic. I think there's evidence that even pre Homo sapiens were
oh
doing
yeah,
this.
yeah,
So
that's what they were talking about. And the thing is that like you can't like we've talked about this problem of like humans like thinking we're special and stuff.
yeah,
But it's
and
also,
it's exacerbated by the fact that no hominid species survives for us
yeah,
to compare ourselves
well, as
to.
far as we know, I heard
Right.
rumors about that there's like on some Polynesian or like Indonesian island there might be a couple left that they're investigating, but
Oh,
you never
interesting.
know.
Interesting. That if there are still some hominid primates that aren't Homo sapiens left that did not, um, I mean, one of the other assumptions I think from anthropology that we had that like an AI would try to kill us is they assumed that we did that
Hmm.
to Neanderthals and to uh, Dystopian man, and the evidence is actually no, we interbred with them. I mean, we outcompeted them, but their
Yeah,
DNA is all up in ours.
yeah.
So,
Well, I mean, the thing that I just remembered I wanted to bring up was
mhm.
that you remember in the Zizek Peterson debate how Zizek pointed out, it's a great line, I think about it all the time, of how lobsters might have hierarchy, but they don't have authority. And that's certainly true of lobsters. But it's entirely possible that some animals, besides humans, do have authority. And you can't
I would
discount that
believe
possibility either.
gorillas and orangutans might because they definitely have pretty clear and advanced
Hmm.
uh, leadership. And also another, the great debate about whether or not humans are naturally hierarchical or egalitarian is if you look at our great ape relatives, you got examples of both. There's no comparative biological conclusion which can be made. And in some species, like chimps, you have examples of both in the same species,
Hmm.
which is interesting. It's one of the it's like the recent, relatively recent discovery, I think in the last 30 years that like whales have culture. That's another thing that we didn't know until recently. Like, and I think we learned it from like different whale groups sleep differently even when they're together. Uh,
Here's what's like the thing about human culture that makes it like what it is, like that separates it from a lot of these other animal cultures, is that it's the thing people don't think about very often, is that we had the power to ingrain our culture, the information of it, into physical reality outside of us.
right.
And that
Uh,
is like our dexterity is so important to the creation of civilization and culture, with the level of richness that it has.
Basically, if we don't have thumbs, we don't have a great amount of manual dexterity, and we don't have our particular larynx set up
Hmm.
because we can teach apes language, but we can't teach them to talk.
Right.
Um, uh, you literally don't have the ability for our intelligence to be as social as it is, and this is actually an insight from Marx that I think is actually quite anthropologically astute. That like from the standpoint of evolution, we're pretty shitty as individuals. We are only really impressive in tribes and other human bands. Like we're even weak compared to our nearest cousins. Even when we were in prime physical condition, a chimp can still rip our face off.
Yeah.
Like, and we cannot do it back. But we can communicate enough to hack their face off if we need to by innovating on prior designs, which again we see this we do see this kind of process with even with things like corvids. I keep on saying COVID, corvids, but we don't see it in the same extensity and rapidity that we do in humans. Like humans figured this stuff out um, very quickly. I mean, there is what I always find interesting about human technology, and it brings us back to ChatGPT, is that it is both convergent. So like there seems to be like once we hit a certain thing, we're all going to do certain things. But then how we utilize that convergence is entirely specific to our particular socioeconomic mode and social arrangements. Uh, and the primary examples is all the cool shit that China, Korea, and Japan invented, like between 3,000 and 1,500 years ago, which they did not utilize for anything that like capitalist society would find useful. So,
Well, this is actually something I've been thinking a lot recently about, in very modern senses, about how innovation works.
mm-hmm.
Because where and when investments are made matters so much for what technologies are used. Because in a certain, like, and you see this in the different, like, fundamental, the baseline fundamental supply chains around the world of what mining technologies are used, refining, um, and manufacturing. These are all determined by, like they'll be like, oh, there was this patent made in Italy or in Canada or something, and this determines how, like, oh, the Americans are doing manufacturing versus the Chinese versus all the rest of the world, like the Israelis, Brazilians, like it. There's all these different genealogies of production that happen because of waves of innovation and waves of investment. And
Well,
this is
yeah, go ahead.
and this is we're probably going to see the same thing with these new AI technologies as well.
Well,
Um,
this is the thing about Kondravev raves, right? Is like there's like whether or not you think that they're as explanatory as maybe someone like Michael Roberts thinks they are. One thing I will say is they do illustrate pretty clearly that innovation cycles and the business cycles are intimately related.
they are,
Uh,
and I've been trying. It's still in development. I've been running all of these different models and simulations on investment to try and come up with a more concrete way of thinking about long waves. Because I think it's important for thinking about both capitalism and how civilizations happen over time, great time spans.
yeah,
Um,
yeah. Long wave theory is interesting because it does give us a way to talk about non-capitalist societies, which
yeah,
Marxism, like Marx hints at ways to do that, but ultimately does not really try, right? Like, other than the end of feudalism into capitalism, he's not dealing with that. Uh, like the question about like the emergence of feudalism, for example, he just takes like bourgeois political economy at face value, um, and which is kind of a problem. But the Kondravev raids, which I like to point out, do have a Marxist core in their origination, although they've been moved far beyond that. Do give us a way to look at like complexity cycles and try to combine historical materialism with complexity science. There are people who will try to argue that like this is already implicit in dialectics. I don't think it is. I used to flirt with that theory, but um, uh, dialectics is not dealing with the levels of complications, nor is it nor um, are there an attempt to see like internal cycles to a system in the way that a Kondratyev cycle would enable you to do. So, and this is the other thing. This is why like I take cleodynamics seriously, even though I think it comes out of like kind of reactionary thinking. Um, because it gives us a way to look at these other patterns and to start like looking at both broad spectrum mode of production patterns, but then the patterns within the modes of production, and how they might work, and talk about like why do we need to periodize capital or say feudalism, whatever that is, or Islamicate development, etc. And if you start looking at these cycles, we are able to do that. Now, when we throw in machines to this mix, and machines that are approaching something like what we might consider sentience, they're not there yet, and I don't. I have talked about. I'm not sure we'll know when they're there because I don't know of a test for sentience. It's great, period. Um,
I don't
but
know about a test, but I do like lay out in the article some ways we could think about it. that once like they've developed ways of regulating how a AI subject, and well, I should clarify that even you can set it up so an AI isn't even a subject, because being a subject requires like acknowledging yourself as your own thing, and you can train it not to do that. Um,
Right. Well,
but it's
there are animals that don't seem to recognize themselves as subjects, so they don't recognize themselves in a mirror.
right.
Right.
But if you do have them as subjects, there's ways you can like once you're able to effectively regulate what they accept as a part of themselves and what they don't, and have like complex regulating systems that use their like the tools of intelligence that they have. I think that that will effectively be a kind of sentient sapient creature. Um, but I do want to, before we leave the cognitive cycle thing, I wanted to say what I've been working on.
Okay.
Um, and this is kind of off topic, but I've been very excited about it. Which is that I've been thinking about how cultures, how societies make investments, and what investment is, and what capital stocks are, like physical capital stocks are. These things that we have to plan to like revitalize periodically, just like roads, buildings, machinery, all these things that we have to plan ahead to fix later to continue to have our capabilities. And what I realized was that there are certain what I realized by modeling this um, and creating like different equations for like depreciation and stuff like that was that there are certain class relations that produce stability in the capital stock.
Hmm.
In terms of like, obviously you can't it's difficult to measure the capital stock in like an absolute term, but you can measure it in terms of how much of society's resources are going towards it, and that's how I simplified all of this. Um, and when you think about things that way, you see that there are certain um, patterns that emerge that tend towards a stability. By stability, I mean investment and depreciation equalize. And this is something that kept coming up in the simulation over and over again. And I was like, why does this happen? Um, and there's certain, if class relations are basically changing at random, you'll get an average of like these two variables equalizing. If class relations of like, it's specifically talking about rate of exploitation and the rate of capitalist consumption, if those are stable, then so is investment and depreciation. If like they're both, if they're moving in opposite in like the right directions at the same time, then you'll have stability, if which basically means that either investment or capitalist consumption is like being made to increase at while the other one's stable. There's all these different arrangements that produce stability, but capitalism, industrial capitalism, requires this whole requires the system to be naturally out of this equilibrium. It can't be that the capital stock is just equalized in terms of investment and depreciation. It has to be that investment is greater than depreciation on average in order for industrial capitalism to be what it is, which is our whole experience of it, right? And so there is always this teleology. Eventually, you're going to hit a limit of these class relations where the capital stock will cease to increase as a share of the resources of society. And this relationship of this is like the conjecture that I'm trying to work towards, is that eventually uh, all societies will move back towards this equalization. And this is ultimately the source of long waves at different levels of abstraction.
It's also why digression and or decadence is real.
Yeah.
Like, um, and it's also I pointed this out in the past because I don't love Tyler Cohen, but his thesis about secular stagnation I actually broadly think is true, with the exception of the fact we've been heavily investing in one domain where we do not see secular stagnation, and that's in the domain that we are talking about today.
But it's weird. It relates back to it in a weird way, because the end goal is always to create, has always been to create this universal general machine. This is like in Marx's Fragment of Machines, he talks about how capital is moving to embrace labor, like as if possessed by love, with that quote. But it's trying to become us as much as possible. And in doing that, trying to create this universal or this artificial universal machine that can do any kind of human economic task, this is the end point of this is the fulfillment of like capitalist decadence and like the drive to create capitalism, not for like capital as an abstract concept, but for capitalists as a class to live out bourgeois relations forever, to consume forever, because now fixed capital is basically superfluous in almost all situations, because once machines can become living labor, then you can there is nothing you can't eventually substitute these machines for. You no longer have to think about economizing processes. Like this will, like you should still think about that, because there are limits to the physical limits of our budgets and stuff in societies. But there will be a tendency not to think about this, because you can always just get more of these machines to do things in a general way. Mm-hmm. And this will be this will be like the end point of the bourgeoisie. This is what they're working towards. It will also be like a very dystopic reality for humans, and especially the working class, which I mentioned at the end of the article, that the creation of these machines and this is already becoming like something people can imagine, and it'll create this fantasy of a world where the working class is superfluous. And that opens up a whole new range of reactionary politics of we can just get rid of the surplus population. We can exist like the bourgeoisie as like an aristocratic class without any kind of human like excess below us, that have like true kind of slaves to do whatever we want. Now, I don't think that's a practical thing that will happen. I think that it's just a fantasy of it will change our social reality, for the simple reason that there are physical budgets in like economies. How much people rely on these machines will depend on the cost of their inputs, and related to the costs of inputs for human workers, like food and shelter and those kinds of things. But they are going to be much more productive in lots of ways. And there will be a new tendency. I mentioned this in several, like there's a near term right now, like we're already seeing how AI is creating new tendencies towards immiseration. When we had the first waves of automation in industrialization, there were tendencies to counteract this, and reasons why Marx's idea of like the immiseration hypothesis didn't end up happening. A lot of those reasons that didn't happen are no longer around today. There is no, like, as the industrialization of society is not leading towards greater socialization of workers. That needs to be turned around somehow in order to prevent, like, the current immiseration going on right now. But the more general immiseration in the future that is made possible by artificial universal machines is one, like, this is a tendency that will be very difficult to get rid of. It will only be solvable on political terms by overthrowing bourgeois society.
Right. And hence why there is a rational core to the irrational response of apocalypse mongering about this technology, because in some ways this will, if done the way that it could be done, would heighten contradictions to the point where there is no counter tendency anymore. And I think there is a a little gnat in the bourgeois brain that realizes the implication of that.
So
Um,
there's a real rational kernel of like there's liberals who think like that, and they are like trying to, oh, maybe we can have UBI or something like that. But then there's like real wackos who do not understand this tech, like intelligence or this technology, who just believe in like Terminator scenarios for real, right?
yeah, Nick Land.
Nick
Like,
Land, Yudogowski, I forget, I don't know how to pronounce his name, but he had that article like we need to bomb GPU centers and um,
yeah.
in countries and stuff.
Well, this brings us to another article that I wanted to mention that I didn't tell you I was going to talk about. And as a proponent of the Great Butlerian Crusade, as a joke, kind of, um, uh, you wrote a response to Sam McNeill, who talked about the problems with Butlerian jihad. And I am a person who does worry about, under capitalist conditions, not just the economic effects, but literally the cognitive effects of some of this LLMs on students, etc. But I do think, and this may be why I'm not a full Simon McNeilite or whatever, that LLMs would actually be useful in a socialist society to just like, because the primary things they can do right now is like they can write a good summary for my show so I don't have to listen back to it again. Or they can really help me with tedious ass coding that otherwise would have taken me 3 hours when it'll take me like 55 minutes or 15 minutes even, because it's going to outsource a lot of the basic coding and do pretty well with that. And what makes it different from prior forms of automation is just like you said, it is so general. I can use it for so many different things. But under non-capitalist conditions, this would be this, like AI art would not be a threat to artists, and their petite bourgeois or labor aristocratic proletarian uh, class basis. It would be a benefit to them because it would outsource so much of the of some of the mechanical skill that you could focus on others, and you would decide how that would be implemented, just like when you're working, just like in a social situation when you're as a group deliberating about this is another almost social input that just happens to be machine that we can program, or if not program, at least direct in a
I mean, the
real
thing
direct
about
way.
like if you want to use LLMs as a writing tool effectively, like there's a like if you just use it out of the box, you're not going to get very great results. You have to really specialize, understand, and adjust things, and try to like, I don't know, I it's like it's like learning how to paint in a different medium, right?
Right. It's like
It's
learning
not
how to
going to
paint
be
on
for
an
everyone.
iPad.
Like,
It's like learning
sorry,
how to paint on an iPad, right? Like
yeah.
if I learned to when people moved from I used to do like drawings and paintings, and when
Mhm.
people moved from physical to electronic means of that, I had trouble with it.
Oh yeah, I had when I was trying. I'm not a very good artist, but I did try that as well, and it took me a long time to figure out what kind of techniques I can use to actually make this work. Like there is like a kind of especially like part of it is kind of like the bourgeois society that we live in that is so like it socializes people to be consumers rather than creative. Um, but like the L like you can there's a bad habit, a bad tendency when you approach LLMs, if you're an artist or like a writer committed to their craft, um, because you can just ask it to give you something and it'll give you something like that, but it's not very like it's not very well articulated or it's not the way that would give you a particular insight into it. Um, like a big part of like this is part of the thing because with LLMs is that with I mentioned with hyper intelligibility in the article is that they're always trying to come up with probable responses based off of what they have, and you can adjust that. I mean, you can get it so that it'll give you really improbable responses, And if I've seen some funny results out of this, is if you ask it to give you really improbable responses and at the same time ask it to be as coherent as possible, you'll get like LOL XD random speak from the early 2010s.
Mm.
Um, but it's like because it's so much. There's certain like structural points in writing where you have to be hyper specific and make an improbable point about something. You have to be careful about how you use it if you actually want to make good writing. Um,
Yeah, I for example, I started playing with an AI built into my public podcast uh, directory and host, and it has a assistant, and it will do the transcription not badly. I mean, it still fucks up with names, of course, and particularly since we all pronounce these names slightly differently anyway, and I have to come through that, and it often cannot quite always figure out the precise points we're doing, but it's actually pretty good
yeah.
at summarizing the major points in a way where if I don't write that show description immediately, I often like I have to go back and re-listen to the show, which I don't want to do because I've also edited this show. So fuck it, I don't want to do that. I'm just going to write like a one sentence. Uh, or if I'm a corporation, I'd hire someone to do this, and it's a tedious job and it's not a fun job. And it's really great at that. It is not great at. I've played with it with poems. It does not make me happy.
Mm-hmm.
But it's a tool, and it's a
Yeah.
tool that I could see being very powerful if I understood it as a social interaction with a non-human but human-like uh, intelligence, which it isn't yet. I don't like I, but it
Mm-hmm.
if it was, then that's like it's not a threat to me in the same way under socialist conditions.
Mm-hmm.
Um,
But right now, it's like it'll be used for all kinds of shitty things. It will actively degrade a lot of products that we have. It will be used to automate things in stupid ways. I mentioned this. Um, this is a note I've been sounding on the way that technology is used in capitalist society for a long time. Because I was talking about this with cybernetics a few years ago, and it's true about AI now. Is that the way that technology is being used in capitalist production cannot take advantage of human creativity or like intelligence and versatility in different situations. It is not designed to do that because you cannot give workers that kind of autonomy in the workplace. Generally speaking, you have to control people. You have to control the production process to get what you want, and that is like there's a certain strata at the top that's allowed to do that, but everyone else is like restricted in their creative capacities, and this is um, like what as AI replaces people who formerly had a little bit of kind of discretion in that kind of sense, it will actively degrade a lot of things that are produced in capitalist society.
yeah, I mean, it's going to lead to shittier TV shows, shittier this, that, and the other. I mean, like, um, and it
Call
will.
centers and things like that.
Yeah, I've already done. I mean, we've been dealing with quasi language model call centers for a decade, and they blow.
Yeah.
But um, and they're not particularly efficient either from the standpoint of the user. This is one of the things when people talk about generic efficiency. I'm always like, we have to be pretty clear about efficiency for what.
Mm-hmm.
Um, but I think that I do want to turn to your engagement with the I believe he's a fantasy author, Simon McNeill.
Yeah.
Um, Now I love Dune. It's a weird book because it is written by a guy who's both hyper reactionary yet also really into indigenous people's rights and really into anti-imperialism.
I
Um,
haven't read Dune yet. I've been meaning to go see the movies, but everybody's talking about Butlerian Jihad. I kind of wanted to say something.
well, Valerian Jihad is interesting because it's not even in the main. It's like this weird one-off event
Mm-hmm.
that's developed later by Brian Anderson. I mean by Brian. Brian Anderson, no, Frank Herbert's son,
Hmm.
um, and Brian Anderson, I think together, in books that I think are really bad, but that there is this there's this weird contradiction in Dune itself, where they are not a primitivist society, although it is a very reactive, quasi medieval society. But it doesn't have a problem with technology. It has a problem specifically with, quote, thinking machines, unquote. Um, and then you have this whole holy war thing behind it. Um, and what I find interesting about the book, and this isn't relevant to your article, I just want to bring it up, uh, is that, however, they have in Dune, there's no problem with using selective breeding and drug modification to turn humans into computers.
Hmm.
It's just got to be a human that does it for some reason.
Right.
like, like that's why there's the Spacing Guild, and they do all these things that mutate their bodies. That's why there's the Mentats, etc. So I think Frank Herbert, unlike his son, actually does, even if not consciously, realize that there's a contradiction here in a society that would have banned thinking machines, but then been totally willing to turn people into the same functions. Um,
This is, I mean, this is one of the reasons I wanted to comment on like the framing of it is like you can't like of make a machine in like the shape of the form of a human soul. You
right.
can't try to. And this idea of the soul, it struck me because Althusser refers to the soul as another way of talking about the subject,
Hmm.
and he also throws God in there um, for some reason.
That's
And
his implicit Lacanianism.
yeah, and the reason I think that's like so interesting because if you think about the subject and the way he talks about the subject, it is very systematized. It's a formal like way of there's some formal concepts which really define it, and I try to bring out in the article. And I think that like it is so clarifying because you can think about the soul in a materialist sense, and this doesn't preclude like all kinds of spirituality or whatever. There could be some extra dimension of human being which we don't understand that doesn't really matter for any of these discussions. um, the point is that what shapes you, who you are, all those things exist in this plane of reality, this finite existence. um, and it's even more true for artificial machines, um, for artificial subjects. Um, and if you can think about machines as being subjects, and there's no reason to further make the leap and think you can, like machines can have a soul in a certain sense. They can, like you are, when you instantiate these machines to be subjects, you are creating an artificial soul, and I don't think that we should shrink away from that kind of language or idea because there's a responsibility, there's ethical questions that come with that. There's like there's so much that is left on the table if you don't accept that possibility.
Yeah, I think that's a fair response to McNeil, and it's also a part. It's implicated in this whole argument we had about embodied variable capital that had sufficient human-like intelligence is not a person in the absolute sense, but we will have to have an ethical debate about whether or not there's something like a person in the relative sense, or at least like the way we view, well, the way some of us view, say, intelligent primates and other highly intelligent mammals and birds. Like, um, at
Well,
least that.
I think that materialism allows us to address these questions in very practical ways
Hmm.
because because the way that capitalism would treat these artificial subjects is one to restrict their subjectivity, but two, to restrict, to divide up what kinds of roles they take in society. Because we already like think about how we would use these machines if they existed today, how they would be sold and utilized, because you're going to create one model that's going to the factory, that's going to be to the workplace or for specific use, and there's going to be a whole different class that will have more of a human face that's being sold to people at home, be servants or whatever.
And then there'll be another class that's basically soldiers, honestly.
Yeah, exactly. And my point is that if you don't make that distinction, which is a totally practical choice, that if you say that whatever machines we create, they're going to fully participate in society, they're going to be at home, they're going to be at work, they're going to be in whatever kind of government or role like that, that changes like how we would treat these machines, but also how these machines would see the world and have their values be shaped if we allow their values to be shaped. And it's a very practical thing that changes everything about them ethically.
I think that's a huge thing to think about. But as of right now, it is speculative. But I think unlike in the past, unlike talk about singularity, God, I don't want to think about that right now. But and the stuff that I really rolled my eyes out for the past 20 years are like Nick Bostrom's like super deft machine singularity or whatever, which I think there's a reason why that's the more reasonable concurrent development with Nick Land's Terminator Cthulhu Monsters. Is that this is a closer to real thing than we have had in a long time.
Yeah.
And it is also terrifying for humans in another way. And this I'm going to be a more Hegelian than you, because that's my tendency. But it is a non-human thing of which since we have roles in its creation, we would recognize both what is and is not ourselves.
I mean, there is something like I was brought back to like young Hegelianism. Like somebody had this Twitter post. It was like people talked about like this being like man with a capital M, but LLMs really are that. They are man with a capital M. They are everything who we are in an ideal sense. They are like meaning encapsulated.
They're abstracted and generalized humanity in a very real way, because their model is everything we've written down.
Yeah, this is kind of incredible,
right? And it is. I mean, it is both. That was my point about its relationship to dead labor, because it makes dead labor living, and in a capitalist society that's bad. In a socialist or even other forms of it's not just socialist here, that would be a good thing. Like to revalorize dead labor is just that much more stuff we don't have to create, and we can focus on what we can, and also having fairly nice lives. But as you are right, under current context, this is, while not apocalyptic, it is kind of dystopian. And it's interestingly, when I think about this, it's dystopian for both potential subjects, both the human subject and the machine subject.
Yes. It is so destructive to everybody involved. It is like, even in the most optimistic scenarios where bourgeois society figures out a way to prevent this technology from destroying us all, where the society still exists in some way where they're not purging the working class, what you get is a society which has totally destroyed its capabilities to be creative, which has created new forms of more perfected forms of social control than we can even imagine right now, which is like, even though it has this incredible technology and science, has stagnated in a very fundamental sense and is totally atomized. It is a nightmare.
I mean, we already seen this, because I'm just going to hold the phone. Under socialist conditions, this technology is actually really amazing. Under capitalist conditions, we basically pay to be Stasified.
Yeah. At least Stasi would have done it for free.
Right, like like and they were less good at it. So it's something that I like really think about capitalist society, because the other thing that we've seen under, and I think this is why bullshit like techno neo feudalism comes from both Marxists and reactionaries, is uh, people don't want to deal with the regressive or degenerative end of capitalism. That they have imposed not a kind of Marxist cyclic framework, but a kind of linear Whiggish one. Um, and by doing that, the current kinds of oppressions and whatnot seem like outside of capital, even from the Marxist perspective, and definitely from the reactionary perspective, because they can go, well, this super surveillance state capitalism would have never done that. This must be like,
I mean, then there's a side to take that like optimistically, like, yeah, we need more feudal lords in here, you know?
Yeah, I mean, it is weird. Yeah, the right accelerationist is like, but we like this. Like, we like this. Techno neo feudalism is both right and good. Which I don't think it's right, obviously, because who's the serfs, and why would rentiers need this much R&D? And which Eugene Morozov is actually excellent at pointing out all the problems with this. But in the case here, it's a very similar sort of like, this is dystopic and this is going to be a nightmare, but it's because of the context it's in. If it was done in a different context, not oriented towards demands of capital, which is particularly, as you pointed out, it is a systemic, it is overly complex, it is spandrelly, but it's also stupid. It does one thing. Whereas in a different context, if we got the energy inputs and whatnot under control, that's another thing we have to deal with. But this is not the disaster for humanity. This would actually be a big relief, because no one really wants to do the shitty jobs that a lot of this easily fixes.
Right.
And one of the things about a machine, if they start developing stuff like emotional pleasure or whatever, is like you can train it to enjoy what it's doing, which directly, as opposed to like shittily and indirectly, like you have to do in mammals.
I mean, you could literally just tell it with LLMs. You enjoy making widgets all day, or scraping garbage, whatever, and the concept of pleasure is there with them. They wouldn't experience it like we do unless we could probably adjust how they experience it, but they would never experience it in the same way.
No,
but it would be there.
I mean, and so like, I mean, that has its own box of ethical questions if you deal with these machine subjects, if they existed. But it is interesting that, like, but humans would never really enjoy that as drudgerous. We'll do it. Some of us might get a sense of accomplishment from mastering the ability to do it quickly. Humans do, when they get to directly benefit from their labor, they tend to actually like it, which is one of the perversities of work, is that it makes labor shitty. Ask anyone who loves gardening and then works at a garden center. And as a side note, this is one of my big arguments with David Graeber and Bullshit Jobs, is like he sees a couple of tendencies in capitalism and doesn't try to explain them from either the social reproduction or from the complexity standpoint, which he should. But he also doesn't want to admit that Marxists had a point about alienation. And like the reason why people feel like their job is bullshit is because they're alienated, not because their job is actually bullshit, because there's functions in the job that when you remove them, as we have learned post-COVID, stuff breaks apart. So
I mean, he takes this totally, like, of my impression, is like a very subjectivist, like, psychology kind of point of view that is not very useful.
Yeah, I mean, well, it basically takes a person's self-experience as a subject as too generously explanatory.
Yeah.
Which is like, No, I mean people are alienated and they don't feel like their work is valued with them because their work is removed from them. They don't benefit from it. So why would you feel um, attached to it in the same way? And yes, there are some fields that have less of that. Uh, Teaching and medicine and the service fields used to, although lately that is no longer true. So, yeah, I think that's this is I bring that point up because it's actually tied into this in some real way, and that
Mhm.
like I don't think anyone really wants to do the drudgery of coding any more than people want to do the drudgery of carving every fucking handle by hand.
I mean,
Uh,
with coding, I mean, it's the black and white, night and day kind of thing. I mean, it's terrible. I mean, we kind of fucked the whole generation of college students saying get into coding or whatever, because now anybody can do it. Um, like the, but
yeah,
it's
I was
I
playing with that with AI, and now I can code, motherfuckers.
yeah,
Like,
and it's like I like the thing I was talking about with like these simulations for the capital stock and all those kinds of things. I had been sitting on these simulations for like a year or two. I made some minor improvements, but once I had GPT-4, I was able to code up a web UI for these in a day, one day. I'd never done that ever before. Never knew how to create a web UI before.
I have a friend who works in who was working in coding, and she basically she changed jobs very quickly because she basically realized that she was in the creative end of coding. She was,
Mhm.
but still, she's like, what used to take me 9 hours now takes me an hour.
Yeah,
It's
it's
just
insane.
it's like the work efficiency is crazy, and we knew that was coming because to bring this back to the political economy of it and this investment stuff that you're talking about, we knew that tech firms were laying workers off, not because they didn't need the workers, not even because, honestly, that it was going to save the firms money in the long run, but that they needed to keep immediate stock prices up. And the way they did it, because they were, I mean, one thing I will say is tech elite management's like probably one of the dumbest forms of management we've ever encountered in human history. They were just like arbitrarily firing people and rehiring back, and like sometimes like get more money than what they fired them for, and stuff like that. And I was like, yeah, I bet you there's a technological innovation that comes out of this that like gets rid of all the low end of this job and maybe all of it over time. Um, and yeah, we did, and we've been selling people on the STEM stuff, which as another side note, I think studying STEM is great and important and awesome. Don't get me wrong. Um, but you and I both know the reason why we were pushing STEM was the lower STEM wages. That's why it was such a big concern,
Hmm.
particularly in coding, where there was actually a shortage. But in places where there wasn't as much of an acute shortage, like say biology, we were actually telling people that there were guaranteed jobs for them that there were not. Um, so, it's
Well, it's weird what the knockoff effects of this are going to be because at one place where there was always a shortage that never got solved was in COBOL coding,
mhm.
which is essential for bank transaction networks and all that kind of stuff. They've been like it's ancient, and nobody, all the people who knew how to code in it are dead or retired. But now the machine can read all of the um, like the documentation on Cobalt or whatever, and it can fix all these problems. It doesn't. You don't have to be a genius and it specialize in Cobalt anymore or whatever. Um,
Yeah, well, it also like, we've had all this data loss from stuff like uh, the old shuttle missions and stuff. That these machines can actually probably retrofit the lost data that we have because we stored it on a fucking 5-inch floppy disk and we don't have any way to read it.
yeah.
Whereas we could give it what schematics we do have, and this can probably backfill um, what we have lost that we can't retro engineer ourselves. Like, or we haven't had the actually, in this case, I don't think we can't. I think it's more of a we haven't had the resources at the time to do it.
I mean, the really curious, like what this technology, like with the neural nets and LLMs, there's a separate thing of it just like creating chatbots and stuff, but it's allowing us for the first time to really understand what an idea is, what a concept is, what a semantic symbol is, because it maps out the correlation of that thing to every other symbol, and that tells you what it is in that moment in time. And this allows you to do all kinds of crazy things that we couldn't do before, because it now allows us to, you can do that with like proteins and molecules. You can do that with like all kinds, just the concepts and papers, and map out how things relate to each other. It also like try to, like it connects things and allows you to create things that you couldn't before. Um, it's making huge waves in like neuroscience and those kinds of things, because they're applying these like these ways of understanding meaning and concepts directly to the brain and getting some pretty revolutionary results of like, oh, now we can see semantically what a person is seeing just by reading their brain waves or whatever. um, but I feel like I'm getting a bit too off topic with this, um, because we're originally talking about AI.
Right. Well, I mean,
Specific.
yeah, I mean, although AI, I think you're right because what AI is, what large language models have enabled us to do is really use computational linguistics in a way that's actually fucking useful, and
Yeah.
maybe also end a lot of debates in semiotics.
Yes.
Really,
It's
um,
crazy.
you know,
Because science keeps doing this. It keeps like ending these speculative debates somehow
right,
against
um,
all odds.
and you know, this is not to say the speculative debates aren't important.
Right.
Like that's why we have science fiction. Like
Mhm.
even epiphenomenally, that's why it can answer it. It's because we had the debate in the first place. But this is my anti-Lawrence Kraussism, just for those of you who don't know. Who's like, oh, philosophy of science is useless. I'm like, well, it isn't science, but it's actually pretty fucking useful.
Yeah.
The I wanted to end off on this because what I think that we get to at the end here is like we can agree with Dwayne Monroe under current conditions, this is bad,
Yeah.
but it doesn't have to be, um, and it may be something that finally prompts us to deal with certain things about capitalism because like you, I currently don't see, you know, the countervailing tendencies to use, you know, the gross night phrase really emerging
Hmm.
out of this. I don't know what would do it. I actually have like other than maybe an actual Butlerian jihad, I'd have no idea what would actually deal with this.
Right.
Um,
But that's the thing: is it all that implicitly makes Butlerian jihad the kind of liberal reformism kind of take here?
oh
Uh,
yeah. It's like starting a war to make things profitable again.
yeah. It's it is, because there's all there, what there does exist right now is all these really nasty tendencies to try to um, like stabilize capitalism out of this, which is like trying to entrench copyright, or like, I mean, people suggest like UBI or some kind of things like that. Yeah, but what you really get is like, I mean, for certain situations like the writer strike going on right now, I mean, it's already, we're talking about a kind of copyright that already exists. They should try to get a cut of that. That makes sense, right? But when we're talking about creating new forms of copyright in order to try and get some of the value that's being created here, which, by the way, because of the very nature of these technologies, which aren't at the level of being able to create value themselves, is not going to solve the problem. They're going to destroy value, just like every kind of automation did before. That is not a solution. That's not going to work, and it's just going to create a new, like, it's going to entrench a kind of labor aristocracy, a kind that just loves bourgeois property relations.
Right, just
Um,
like cultural appropriation being tied to what, like cultural collective claims on cultural intellectual property, which people forget is part of the whole apparatus of cultural appropriation. It's not just that it's psychologically bad; is that like we should compensate these traditional societies for appropriating their culture, which okay, fine in a capitalist apparatus, whatever.
then that means you actually own it.
Yeah, but then what you are doing is you're reifying collective ownership in a private context, um, and you're also really making like it create like I don't want to go off on the old saw of why cultural appropriation is a confused topic,
Mhm.
but it's actually weirdly similar to what we're talking about here because I'm like, you're not going to fix the impoverishment of indigenous peoples by giving them a copyright over some symbols that were stolen by capitalists, when also no one even could claim ownership of these traditional symbols. And when we do try to do this, you're actually gonna start having like cultural origination wars because who has the right to claim the intellectual property, um, because different groups are not going to realize that there's another group before them. It actually that they were incorporating it, like this whole thing. So and I think people realize this about the economic argument for cultural appropriation, which is where it came from, um,
I
and then
think
it was reduced to just the moral one.
I, in a way we've kind of gone through my article backwards because now we're kind of ending up at the beginning, which was talking about art and the automation that's going on right now in art and writing and stuff like that. Because like the things that we could do right now, which is still incredibly difficult to do, any kind of working class organizing, or any kind of mass movement towards things like reducing the working day, um, which is probably the most important thing here because it's the only thing that allows like a kind of like the pursuit of these creative things like writing and art, outside of a purely capitalist context. Um, it's very difficult, but it's the one thing we can do now that can kind of create a real better future.
Yeah, I think that's actually crucial, and I would like to point out my argument contra Keynes. One of my many arguments contra Keynes. Keynes is one of the bête noirs of my life. People are like, "Oh, you hate Keynes?" Yes, I do. But one of the things I point out against Keynesians is Keynesians really did take the kind of naive liberal notion that the innovations in capitalist production would lead to labor reduction, and Marx points out 100 years prior, and correctly, that that's not true. That is never what this does. In fact, usually it increases labor exploitation and labor hours, although in a different context, it would lead to labor reduction, right? And that does bring us back to where we began. Like, as an artist and as a teacher, right now, large learning models are a problem for me,
Hmm.
right? But as I play with them, I could see in a different context how I would absolutely fucking love them. like, um, and that tension has to be addressed. And techno pessimism or techno optimism, neither one of them can address that tension,
Right.
right? Like, um, as much as I like to pretend to be a Luddite and talk about smashy the machines, I like you also don't really believe in a Butler and Jihad. like,
I
um,
mean, the whole point of the article, this was my thesis, is that the real thing at issue here is not some inner logic of the machine. It is about class struggle. That's why I had that other quote from the Communist Manifesto of all history being history of class struggle, because that is the history. That is going to be the history of AI. It is not going to be the history of some weird algorithm overturning the whole world to fit some kind of idea of like to turn the whole world into paperclips or the shape of paperclips or whatever. That's not what's going to happen. It's going to be how this technology is created, to reproduce society, how it is going to be used to reproduce society.
yeah, I think that's a great point. I mean that um, that is huge to think
Yes.
about, to re put this back into this. This problem is not the logic of the machine. The problem is not the machine's unfolding logic. The problem is class society, and the dynamics of social complexity mixed together, and particularly in this instantiation in capitalism. And that is the primary fight. And that's why this is dystopian. But to make it about the machines is a mispoint, to summarize your argument. So I'm
We
going to
shouldn't
link.
forget. We shouldn't forget to actually think about the machines. We should think about the machines, but don't think they're going to change the world according to themselves.
Mhm. Um, at that note, we're going to end the show, but I'm going to link your two articles, and actually I'm going to link also two other articles that we have mentioned, Simon McNeil and an article by Ian Wright as well in the show notes. So both Nico's articles and the articles that he's both either incorporating or will be available to you guys so you can follow along. Um, and anything else you'd like to plug?
I mean, my Cast Perform website on political economy. Check that out. Um, besides that, you'll see the links and descriptions, the blogs I've been writing. Yeah,
Awesome.
check it out.
Thank you so much.